The first thing that people need to understand is what is the difference between a medical aid and a hospital plan? Because I get a lot of people that say, oh, I don't want a full medical aid, I just want a hospital plan. But they don't really understand the difference between a medical aid and a hospital plan. It's not the same thing. So a hospital plan, or let's first look at the medical aid. A medical aid is legislated by the Medical Schemes Act, which is a different set of legislation than hospital plans get legislated under, which limits some of the things that medical aids are allowed to do. And we'll talk a little bit about that as I go through. Hospital plans are legislated by the Short-Term Insurance Act, which is a different set of legislation, so their rules are a little bit different. So typically what happens is your old type of hospital plans that only pay you for going into hospital, those things aren't really in the marketplace anymore. The hospital plans that you get these days are more things that pay per day in hospital. So they will say, we will pay you 2,000 Rand per day after the third day of hospital stay. And typically they don't pay the provider. They pay you as the client. They will then also, there's certain hospital plans that pay per condition or per event that happens, and it's a specific amount that gets paid. So usually with hospital plans, they are not 100% cover for medical expenses. With the medical aid, the medical aid pays for the provider, so it will pay the hospital directly, and it usually pays the whole hospital bill. It doesn't matter what happens in the hospital up to certain levels. So your medical schemes rate or medical schemes rate to 200% or 150% of medical scheme rate. But inside your medical aid is a major medical expenses portion, and I'll talk about that a little bit later in the show to explain exactly where that fits in. But that major medical expenses portion is basically your hospital plan built into your medical aid. So when you talk about I want a hospital plan, you still need a medical aid. It's just you only want to focus on the hospitalization or the major medical expenses portion of the medical aid. And like I said, I'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. So why did medical aids become so expensive? I remember when I was a child, my parents paid for medical aid, and you could go to the doctor, you just went and they paid. You went to the dentist, they paid. So you had these sub-limits, but everything else was paid. And so then suddenly around 2000, just before 2000, 1999, 2000, the whole landscape changed with medical aids. You started to get the savings plans, and the whole way medical aids was managed changed, and it became very expensive. Medical aids suddenly became, overnight, it became very expensive, and it just continued that trend. So why did that happen? So here is what happened. At that stage, the Medical Schemes Act, the legislation changed because government decided that they want more people to have access to medical aid, to private hospitalization or private medical care, and therefore they want more people to be able to get onto medical aid. They then decided that the reason people aren't on medical aid is because medical aids get underwritten, and some people that have pre-existing conditions or that are older or things like that are being deprived of having the opportunity to get onto a medical aid. And the solution to that problem was to limit a medical aid's ability to underwrite their risk. Now, this is the big thing with all insurance. Insurance companies are successful only if they are accurate in underwriting their risk, because they need to make sure that the pooled risk benefit that they have is sustainable for the people that they insure. So let's say, for example, you get in 100 million rands worth of premiums a year, but you have to pay out 150 million rands worth of claims. How long do you think the medical aid is going to be solvent and sustainable? So they have to make sure by underwriting that the risk that they carry is sustainable, so that if they get 100 million rands worth of premiums, they only pay out 50 million rands worth of claims. Otherwise, it's not a sustainable model. The government then decided, well, we're going to take away the medical aid's ability to underwrite their risk. And we're only going to give them 3 things they can do to minimize their risk. The first one is they are allowed to put on a 3-month general waiting period on the medical aid. What that means is you start paying for your medical aid. For the first 3 months, you pay your premiums, but you cannot claim from your medical aid. So you basically have a 90-day waiting period where you are not covered, although you are already paying. In that way, they're trying to mitigate the risk, saying that the medical aid then basically gets those premiums to cover their risk in their risk pool. The second one is a 12-month condition-specific exclusion. So let's say you need a heart transplant and you don't have a medical aid. You can then go to a medical aid, join the medical aid. For 12 months, they will exclude that specific condition. But in month 13, the medical aid has to pay for that heart transplant, even if it's going to cost them R1 million. So they can exclude something for 12 months, but they have to accept you. And the third one is they can put on a late joiner penalty for people who haven't been contributing to the risk pool for a period of time. So how that works is if you are older than 35 and you haven't been on a medical aid for more than 90 days, they then have a look at your history and say, how many years have you been without medical aid after the age of 30? According to those years, they then add a penalty on top of your medical aid premium of either 10%, 20%, 50%, depending on how long you haven't been for a medical aid, to sort of penalize you because you haven't been contributing to the risk pool of medical aids. And that's the only thing that medical aids can do, which very much limits their ability to manage their risk. Because here's the practical situation. You can, like I said, the situation with the heart transplant. You know you have to have a heart transplant. You go onto a medical aid for 12 months, you're going to pay premiums. They can't even charge you a higher premium than they would somebody else that is healthy. You pay your premiums, let's say that is 1,500 Rand a month. So you've paid 18,000 Rand into the medical aid. And they know they can only collect 18,000 Rand, but they're going to have a 1 million Rand expense with only collecting 18,000 Rand. And they are not allowed to decline you. This is also something that people don't understand. They don't understand that medical aids are not allowed to decline anybody. Doesn't matter what your history is or your age is. They have to accept you. The only thing they can do is those 3 things: 3-month general waiting period, 12-month condition specific exclusion, or a late joiner penalty. Saying that, what is the effect of that? The effect of that is that medical aids had to increase their premiums to make sure that they still collect more premiums than they're paying out in claims. Because they now can't manage their risk and decline people with a higher risk, the book becomes more risky, which means they have to increase their premiums, and that created exactly the opposite situation of what the government actually wanted, which is typical. So what happened is less people can afford medical aid than they could when they were just paying everything and they could actually manage their risk. So they had exactly the opposite outcome of what they actually wanted. But this is what we are sitting with. Now they want to create a national health insurance, which I'm not going to go into today. That's a whole show on its own, which is going on a complete disaster, the national health insurance. So that is basically the medical aid. So guys, if you are not on a medical aid, anybody that tells you you won't qualify for a medical aid or they won't accept you is talking nonsense. The medical aid is must accept you. That's the difference between a hospital plan, which is legislated by the Short-Term Insurance Act, and that they can underwrite the insurance. They can decline you. They can put a loading onto your premium at any point. They can exclude any condition for any period of time as far as they want to. So therefore, your hospital plans are usually cheaper, but there's much more exclusions, etc., on there.